mentality that he would not ever tell on anybody who he thought was legitimately trying to help him. And I think he was fooled very often in terms of who was trying to help him and who wasn't. So, but I could never quite bridge that. Anyway, we came away from that meeting with this man with a very different view. We came away with the opinion that he did not shoot Martin Luther King. We didn't know what other role he might have played, but we believed he didn't shoot Dr. King. But he raised enough questions in my own mind to let me be worried about what the truth really was, and be concerned about whether or not, in fact, we knew what happened to Martin King. And I thought it was important enough that this enormous figure was taken from us, this prophetic person was removed from us, and no one had ever taken his place, that at least we should try to find out what happened. So I started going into Memphis, Tennessee in 1978, 79, and it became like a slippery slope. And it continued for a quarter of a century. I never envisioned that it was going to take a quarter of a century, but it did. And from 78 to 88, I would go back to the prison and I'd visit James, and I'd ask him questions, and then I'd set out again to Memphis and occasionally into New Orleans, because increasingly New Orleans was coming into the picture. And he kept asking me to represent him, and I said no, for 10 years. And it was kind of like being pursued, for 10 years. And I said no, because I had to be convinced that he not only wasn't a shooter, but that he had no knowing role. And it took me 10 years to be convinced of that. So in 1988, I agreed to represent him, and I started to handle his applications on appeal for a new trial. And I took this case all the way to the Supreme Court, and of course we lost every step of the way. So we were finished around 1991 in terms of the reasonable appellate route. I was living in England, moved to England with a young family in 1981. So I was conducting most of this work whilst living at Cambridge and coming back into America to do it. So there was a travel, commuting burden in the way there as well. But we decided, come up with what we thought was a brilliant idea, to have a trial for James Earl Ray on television. It was called the television trial of James Earl Ray. It was sponsored by HBO, who were brought into the frame by Thames Television, a British production company. And it was telecast on HBO in the United States and on Channel 4 in England. Now that trial took place over 10 days in 1993. It had Marvin Frankel, as a former federal judge, as the judge. Hickman Ewing Jr., who some of you may recall was Ken Starr's number 2 in the Whitewater investigation, was the prosecutor. And Hickman had won 200 consecutive cases as a U.S. attorney in Memphis. And I was defense counsel, and the jury came from all over the country. So we tried that case with a fraction of the evidence that was later to emerge. It took the jury 7 hours of deliberation, a little over 7 hours, to come back and to find James Earl Ray not guilty. Tennessee criminal procedure rules applied. There were no scripts. It was a bitterly fought trial. The judge and I fought continually in chambers about evidence, and though he and I became friends later on, there was much contentiousness in the course of that trial. But you never heard about it. It was not reported, dropped from view, was called entertainment. The only thing we got from it was no further forward in terms of getting James out of prison, but new evidence. New witnesses came forward. Witnesses started to come forward. For example, James had always said he was controlled and moved around the country by a man called Raoul. Hickman Ewing said, Raoul Raoul reminds me of the story of the tooth fairy that my mother used to tell me. This is just another fantasy of James Earl Ray. There is no Raoul. James did. Well, there is a Raoul. There was and there is. He's still alive and well, protected by the government. He lives just outside of New York City, about 40 minutes from New York City. And when I go to one of my favorite Yonkers, New York Italian restaurants, I invariably go by Raoul's house just to see whose license plates are in his driveway. He's still there and alive and well. But Hickman said, no, he doesn't exist. However, an English merchant seaman said he does exist. English merchant seaman Sid Carthew used to come across to Montreal, and he met Raoul in the same bar that James met him in 1967. And Raoul tried to sell him some guns. And when Sid saw this on Channel 4 in England, and he heard Hickman going on about the Raoul thing, he got very upset and he contacted me. Then another woman contacted me from Mississippi. She had lived in Houston and she knew Raoul. She knew Raoul and she knew his cousin. And she knew him from taking arms shipments from Carlos Marcello coming around the Gulf, repackaging them and selling them into Latin and South America. And she used to go down with him sometimes to the Houston docks and pick up these weapons and come back. And she knew Raoul because he raped her. Because one day she was there and she had a key ring that had the pictures of John Kennedy, Bob Kennedy, and Martin Luther King on it. And she put it down on the table where they were repackaging the guns. And one of the guys looked at it and threw it to Raoul, and he looked at it, threw it on the floor and stamped it. Said, I killed that nigger once, looks like I'll have to do it again. Pulled out a gun and took Glenda Gravo into a bedroom on the first floor and raped her. Teach her a lesson, that she should have any affinity or fondness for any of these people. So Glenda knew him, having to leave Houston soon after, because when she went into Percy Foreman's office, who was a well-known criminal lawyer, of course, at the time, Percy was going to represent her husband's brother who had a criminal charge, and she saw memorabilia related to the Ray case in Percy's office. And she said, oh, you know something about that? And he said, yes, I represented James Earl Ray. And she said, oh, you did? He said, yes. And she said, well, was he guilty? She said, well, no, not really, but it was a price that had to be paid, his conviction. And Percy then developed a crush on Glenda and tried to get her to work for him. And so when this thing with Raoul came up, this incident came up, she actually went to him for advice, and he said, I think you and Roy should leave, because I know these people and I know Raoul. So Percy Foreman, James Earl Ray's lawyer, even knew the man who had been the controller of James Earl Ray. So Glenda came forward, told all this story finally. She'd held it in all these years. So we started to get this kind of evidence, but some of the most significant evidence was against a guy called Lloyd Jowers. Now Lloyd owned Jim's Grill, and Jim's Grill backed onto the Lorraine Motel, and it was the cafe in the ground floor of the rooming house which James Earl Ray rented a room on the instructions of Raoul. Okay, so Jowers was in a very strategic position, and all of a sudden we began to get evidence about Lloyd Jowers. We had about 4 witnesses who would have caused him to be indicted if we could have gotten a grand jury to hear the evidence. And Lloyd knew that. So he said to his lawyer, Louis Garrison, go on over to the Attorney General, get me immunity from prosecution, and I'll tell everything I know about this case. So Garrison goes over and he talks to the District Attorney General and says, give my client immunity. You'll be the prosecutor of the century, because he'll give you all the evidence on how Martin King was killed. Well, he was, to their surprise, not only did he not give him immunity, but nobody ever interviewed Lloyd Jowers from that office. They didn't want to know about it. But Lloyd was still worried, because I sent a colleague of mine to sit outside the grand jury room, and every time the foreman came out, he said, look, we've got evidence we want to present to this grand jury. Will you let us in? We're trying to get that grand jury to be independent of the prosecutor. And I sat him there for 2 weeks, and this was not possible. But Lloyd didn't know it wasn't going to be possible. So he said, is there anybody who will let me tell this story on television? And he found a guy called Sam Donaldson. They found a guy called Sam Donaldson. Sam was a very unusual reporter at one point in time. And his kind of rapidly disappeared, including his own demeanor in terms of independence, I think. But anyway, he put him on a program called Primetime Live. That was Donaldson's program. And Lloyd told his story, basically, one evening, Primetime Live.